David grows up. David felt like he finally had it all figured out. He was 46 years old and had finally gotten married and had a job. He was a maintenance man for the Ultra Stabilio clock, which was a very important job indeed. It allowed David, his wife, and the rest of the crew to coast through space in their bubble ship, stuck in time, which was necessary because reality had become quite precarious after one too many wars, and the safest time was a time that was no time, and the safest place was a place that was no place. One day, David and his wife, David Etta, were watching the slow implosion and explosion of unstable neutrinos and staring out at the eerily calm deadness around them, and they smiled. It was another perfect day without beginning or end. The computers engineered the perfect temperature, the perfect TV dinner, and the perfect moralistic fast food TV show for them to watch. David Etta told David it was perfect. And David, who usually smiled and agreed because nanobots kept his brain idling in hedonistic ecstasy, began to wonder if perhaps it was not as perfect as it seemed. He began to ponder and wonder what life was like outside of their bubble ship. What life was like when computers and nanotechnology didn't make perfect cups of Sumatra coffee, when work and pain were a thing. He told David Etta about his pondering, and she laughed, and echoing the words of her mother and his, said life when it was lived on Earth was nasty, brutish, and cold. She thought that would be the end of what she considered inane babbling. But of course it was not. David was tired of just doing what he should, and although in the past this independent streak had only amounted to him staying up past his 7 o'clock bedtime, today he knew would be different. That night he took his macro quantum editing machine into his study and turned it onto himself. Suddenly, he merged with the quantum field, that field where rules didn't seem to matter, and although on the human level he experienced time as frozen, it was not at all frozen here. He suddenly found himself in all time periods at once. To put it simply, he was both present and absent. David was so used to computers telling him what to do, nanobots controlling his every emotion, aligning his chakras, feeding his every hunger, that for a second he did not know what to do. Looking up, he saw a bright light, and in an instant he knew that he and the light were one. David had felt ecstasy before. It was his pre-programmed state. But being here, he felt something he had never felt before. He felt alive. It was wonderful and disgusting and painful and beautiful all at once. It overwhelmed and enveloped him. Since he was on the quantum level, he ceased to be simply David and became something more. He did not want to go back, but knew it was a necessity. But it could wait. David looked about with his micro-magnanimous fire, and he could clearly see that unlike the stable, happy world he thought he lived in, this one was nothing but chaos. And since this world and that one were one and the same, he realized that this chaos must be everywhere. Creation and destruction were both going on all around him at the same time, exploding and imploding. He even looked at himself, his skin and cells all interacting, exploding, recreating themselves and rearranging with supreme wisdom. Nothing at all was constant, not even David himself. As David stared into the time that was no time, in the place that was no place with a self that was no self, he finally understood the meaning of life. It was not to become stronger or to live forever. It was to embrace this divine dance, and as he watched the world, he could see that it all had a reason for existing. And it was perfect. The knowledge that had allowed him to stop time, to freeze his brain in bliss, to extend his life 2 centuries was nothing compared to what he was now experiencing. David wanted to stay here forever, but alas, he knew he could not. With much sorrow, David reached for the button that would catapult him back to the world he knew. But then something told him to look past the explosions and implosions, the chaos and order. And he did, and beyond the emptiness of the void and the chaos of a million things coming into being, he saw a bright, beautiful, iridescent, infinitely complex and perpetually shifting fractal. To explain it was impossible, as it made perfectly good sense to experience it, but to explain the quantumly entangled reality of it was an exercise in futility. Seeing it, experiencing it, he wanted nothing more than to stay, but alas, he knew he had to return. So David turned the quantum detangler on himself and returned to the frozen time of the bubble ship. David rushed into the main hall where everyone was watching their daily, opiating entertainment program, and David yelled that they could not stay in limbo forever, and had to return to the flow of time, the flow of life. His wife, David Etta, laughed, and then everyone else laughed too. We have figured out everything with science, so there is no reason to return. Besides, someone else commented, everything is perfect here, so why would we want to leave? When David insisted, David Etta opened a hatch and pushed David into a hole. David fell for a very long time, eventually reaching the basement of their space bubble. Although it was dark in a basement, it was quite nice. Looking about, David thought he was alone. But then he saw that his uncle was there too. His uncle Davidia, who he had not seen for a very long time. "Let me guess," his uncle said. "You saw the truth behind it all, and told them they had to go back to Earth, and they thought you were crazy." "I did," David said, "but now we are stuck down here. What do we do?" "Well, we are the adults on the ship, so we should be setting the course," Davidia said. David didn't know how they were going to do that, and he was about to break down and cry. "Don't cry," Davidia said. "They forgot to take away your ultra stabilio clock." David laughed in happy surprise. He was right. He had his ultra stabilio clock. "Now let's unfreeze time, head back to Earth, and clean up the biosphere," Davidia said. "But will that work?" David asked, unsure. "I don't know," Davidia said. "But sitting around here, being in eternal bliss all the time is getting pretty boring." David agreed.